The shove came from behind, and Delia Marsh never saw who did it. The crate of crystal flew from her hands and shattered before it hit the water, and then the pool on the 60th floor swallowed her cry whole. She surfaced, pulled in a breath, and the first sound she heard was not her own gasping. It was laughter. 47 people stood ringed around the pool's edge in black tie and silk, and not one of them set down a glass. Dozens of phones came up at once, filming the trembling woman in the water like an act somebody had booked for the evening. Delia reached out a hand. The man standing nearest was exactly 1 step away, and he took half a step back to keep his shoes dry. She grabbed the stone lip of the pool, pulled, slipped, pulled again, slipped again. Somebody behind her spoke, bored, the way a person complains about the weather. "Somebody call maintenance. The pool's dirty now." The laughter broke open a second time. Delia lowered her head. She was 27 years old. She had cleaned the floors of this building for 3 years, and in all that time not one person in the tower had ever asked her name. Then she saw it. The dried-out ballpoint pen had floated to the surface and was drifting toward the deep end, the only thing she still had of Wesley, the only thing left after the fire. Delia let go of the wall and waded after it, water rising to her chin, while up on the deck the laughter grew louder, because they thought she was putting on a show. Not one of them understood what she was trying to save. Not one of them believed a woman who mopped floors could have anything worth saving. Her fingers had just closed around the pen, when the music at the far end of the hall faltered. 1 missed note, 2, then silence. Across the pool, a man in a long black wool coat stopped walking. He didn't shout, didn't raise a hand, didn't say a word, and still the laughter died out from where he stood and spread outward through the hall. 1 whisper. Then the whole 60th floor knew the name. Ambrose Kessler. People said that anyone who crossed him tended to move suddenly to another state, and not once had he corrected any of it. Ambrose took off the coat, handed it to the man beside him, and stepped down into the pool. Suit and all, leather shoes and all. The water reached his waist, and what he did next left the entire 60th floor so quiet that people could hear the water dripping from his sleeve. But to understand why a man like that would wade into a pool for a woman who cleaned floors, you have to go back to that morning, when Delia Marsh sat counting loose change in an empty cookie tin, counting it over and over, and never coming up with enough. If you believe that a person's worth was never meant to be measured by the work they do, leave a like, share this story with someone you care about, drop us a comment, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with Delia. That morning, not a single streak of light had yet appeared over Chicago. Delia Marsh sat at the kitchen table in the 4th-floor apartment of an old building with no elevator, counting loose change. The tin cookie box before her had been emptied the winter before, and now it was used only to hold the coins and crumpled bills she gathered after every shift. She arranged them in small stacks on the plastic tabletop, counted them once, then counted them again, as though the number might somehow change the second time. It didn't. There wasn't enough. The shortfall was exactly the distance between what she had and what she needed, and that distance had never grown any smaller. The kitchen was so cold that her breath gathered in a pale mist before her face. The building's furnace had been broken since before Thanksgiving. The manager said they were waiting for a part, and anyone who had lived there long enough understood that waiting for a part meant waiting until winter went away on its own. Delia wore 2 sweaters beneath her gray-blue uniform, and she had learned to keep her hands warm by wrapping them around a cup of coffee until the coffee had gone completely cold. There was a letter on the refrigerator door. It was the 9th letter from the hospital's billing office, printed on white paper in black ink, its language so polite that it felt cruel. Delia didn't throw it away. She didn't read it again either. She simply turned the page over and taped it with the blank side facing outward, so that if Junie passed by, all she would see was a white sheet of paper with no numbers on it. Delia had done the same with every letter that came before, and now 9 blank white rectangles stood side by side across the refrigerator door, neat and silent, like a small wall she had built between her sister and the truth. A sound came from the hallway. Delia rose, stepped out of the kitchen, and saw Junie standing at the far end of the hall, with 2 crutches tucked beneath her arms. She was 19, her hair tied high, wearing the oversized sweatshirt Delia had bought at a thrift store 2 seasons earlier. The doctor had said that if she practiced regularly, she might be able to leave the crutches behind within a year. Junie hadn't told anyone that she practiced before sunrise every morning, along the 14 steps of that hallway, because she didn't want her sister to see her fall. Delia stopped in the kitchen doorway. She didn't go to her. That was the hardest thing she had ever had to learn. Junie lifted the right crutch first, shifted her weight to the left, and took a step. She made it 3 steps. Then the crutch slipped on the wooden floor, and she buckled, catching herself against the wall with one hand. She let out a long breath, brushed the hair from her face, then pulled herself upright again. The second time, she made it 5 steps. The third time, she made it 7 before she had to catch hold of the bathroom doorframe. Delia stood perfectly still, her hands clenched tightly together behind her back, and she didn't say a word, because she knew that if she opened her mouth, her voice would break. On the 4th attempt, Junie crossed the entire hallway. 14 steps. She stood at the other end, breathing hard, her face flushed, both crutches trembling in her hands, but she remained upright. Then she turned to look at her sister. "Delia," Junie said, her voice still broken by breathlessness. "I can stand now." Delia nodded. She tried to smile. "I saw." "Then don't take any more shifts." Delia didn't answer right away. Junie moved 2 more steps toward her on the crutches, and her voice grew quieter, all the excitement gone from it now. "I hear you get up while it's still dark. I hear you come home while it's still dark, too. I don't know how long it's been since you've had a proper night's sleep." She paused. "I'm practicing so you'll have 1 less thing to do, not so you can take on 2 more. Delia looked at her sister for a long time. She thought about the 9 blank sheets of paper on the refrigerator door. She thought about the empty tin box on the kitchen table, and the little stacks of coins she had counted twice and still found wanting. She thought about the therapy session the following week that she hadn't yet dared to call and confirm, and she thought that there were some truths people left unspoken not because they wanted to hide them, but because once those truths were spoken, the person listening would have to carry their weight for them. "I know," Delia said. "I promise." It was the first time in 2 years that she had lied to her sister. She had accepted the banquet shift at Ashgrove Tower the night before because event shifts paid time and a half, and time and a half would be enough to cover what was missing from the tin box. She went into her room, put on the last layer of her uniform, and tied back her hair. On the nightstand lay a dark blue ballpoint pen. Its plastic casing was scratched, and one side of the cap had been worn smooth because someone had once had the habit of biting it while thinking. Delia picked it up, slipped it into the breast pocket of her uniform, and pressed it firmly into place as she did every day. Then she put on her coat, walked down 4 flights of stairs, and stepped out into the blackness of the Chicago morning. The cleaning crew's break room was on the 2nd basement level of Ashgrove Tower, far enough below ground that no one else in the building knew it existed. The ceiling was low, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and a long table stood in the center of the room with 12 plastic chairs, not one of them the same color. A bulletin board on the wall was crowded with papers that had yellowed with age, and in one corner stood a small refrigerator that Otis Bell had repaired with his own hands after the company said it wasn't worth replacing. Otis was a maintenance technician who had been with the tower longer than anyone else still working there, and every evening before the shift began, he brought down a paper bag filled with sandwiches, cut in advance, and handed one to each person, calling every one of them by their full name: Marjorie Pike, Theodora Vance, Rosalind Kirk. He read the names as though he were taking attendance in some classroom, slowly, never overlooking anyone, and no one in the room knew why he had insisted on doing it that way for so many years. Delia Marsh. She accepted her sandwich, thanked him, and sat down in the orange plastic chair at the far end of the table. At the opposite end, 6-year-old Pearl lay on her stomach across the tabletop, with a box of crayons scattered all around her, her legs swinging in the air, and the tip of her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she concentrated. She was Marjorie's daughter, and every Tuesday night, when her mother traded for a later shift, Pearl sat there coloring while she waited, eating her sandwich before any of the adults had touched theirs. She looked up and held her sheet of paper in both hands. I finished my picture. Everyone at the table turned to look. On the paper was an impossibly tall building, drawn in blue crayon, so tall that Pearl had been forced to bend it to one side to fit it within the edges of the page. And at the very top was a yellow sun, with eyes, a nose, and a smile that covered half its face. "This is our building," Pearl said with great seriousness. "And this is Mr. Sunday. He lives on the top floor." Otis bent down to study the picture and nodded thoughtfully for a long while, as though he were appraising a work of art hanging in a museum. "I've worked here for 3 years, and I've never met this fellow," he said. Would you introduce me to him?" Pearl burst into laughter, and the whole room laughed with her. Marjorie used a piece of tape to fasten the picture to the bulletin board, right in the middle of all those yellowed papers, and for one brief moment, the room on the second basement level seemed a little brighter. Then the door opened. Hollis Draper walked in with a stack of papers tucked beneath his arm, and the laughter died so quickly that no one had time to notice they had stopped laughing. He didn't greet anyone. He went straight to the bulletin board, took down the old shift schedule, pinned up the new one, and as he did, he moved Pearl's picture aside to make room. He didn't do it roughly. He simply moved it aside, the way someone might move a scrap of paper. "This week's schedule," Draper said. "Anyone with questions can submit them in writing." Then he stood there with his back to the board and swept his gaze across the room. His eyes rested on Delia longer than they did on anyone else. He pulled a black notebook from his coat pocket, uncapped his pen, wrote a short line, then closed the notebook and walked out. No one asked what he had written. It had been a long time since anyone in that room had asked Hollis Draper anything at all. 3 nights before the banquet, Delia worked the cleaning shift on the 58th floor. It was the conference room floor, and at that hour the entire level was empty, with only the hallway lights shining through the glass partitions and the steady hum of the air conditioning above the ceiling. She pushed her supply cart into the large conference room, wiped down the long table, straightened the chairs, and gathered the paper cups. In the corner, the document shredder was making a faint whining sound, and its warning light was blinking red. Paper jam. According to procedure, the cleaning staff had to clear it immediately, so the machine wouldn't overheat during the night. Delia set down her mop, walked over, and found the card reader on the side of the machine. Her access badge hung from a cord around her neck, its plastic surface dulled with age, bearing the photograph taken on her first day of work and a row of tiny letters and numbers in the lower corner. She lifted the badge and held it against the reader. The light turned green. The shredder's lid sprang open with a dry click. Inside, a stack of papers had become wedged across the cutting blades. The edges were crumpled, but the pages themselves were still intact, without a single cut through them. She pulled the stack free, smoothed the pages, and was about to drop them into the waste paper bin when she stopped. The backs of the pages were perfectly blank. Junie needed scrap paper for the movement exercises the therapist sent home with her, and paper was one more thing that had to be bought. Delia turned the stack over and glanced at the front. The pages were filled with dense columns of numbers, contract codes, dates, and abbreviations she didn't understand. Then her eyes stopped on one line. The name Marsh was there. She stood motionless in the dark conference room, tilting the papers toward the light from the hallway, and read the line again. She still didn't understand it. Marsh was a common surname, she told herself. There had to be several hundred people in this city who shared it. She would ask someone. She would ask when she had time. She folded the stack of papers in half, slipped it into the pocket of her supply cart, closed the shredder's lid, and went back to wiping down the rest of the table. The following night, she worked a double shift. The night after that, the rent was due. Then she forgot. The elevators in Ashgrove Tower stopped at the 60th floor. To go any higher, a person had to press a sequence known by only a handful of people in the world, and the 61st floor didn't appear on any set of plans ever submitted to the city. Ambrose Kessler stepped out of the elevator at an hour when, beyond the wall of glass, Lake Michigan still couldn't be distinguished from the sky. 3 men were already seated in the room, waiting for him. None of them saw him before he entered. No one gave anyone else a signal, and there were no footsteps to announce his approach. Yet all 3 rose at the same moment, almost in perfect unison, as though someone had just pulled a cord attached to their backs. Ambrose didn't tell them to sit down. He removed his coat, hung it on a hook, and walked to the head of the table. The first man was a banker named Bertram Fell, with salt and pepper hair, a stiffly starched shirt, and a leather briefcase that he didn't open once during the entire meeting. He talked a great deal. He talked about unforeseen difficulties, about the market, about an unfortunate quarter, and about how everything would fall back into place if he were given just a little more time. He spoke for so long without stopping that he had to pause midway through to catch his breath. Ambrose didn't interrupt him. He didn't nod, didn't frown, and didn't offer a single sign that he was listening or that he wasn't. He simply sat there with both hands resting on the tabletop, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and let the other man speak until he had no words left. When Bertram fell silent, there was no sound in the room except the hum of the air purifier. Ambrose still said nothing. He merely reached for the glass of water in front of him and pushed it across the table, slowly, until it came to a stop directly before the other man's seat. Then he withdrew his hand. That was all he did. Bertram Fell stared at the glass of water. The blood drained from his face so quickly that the man beside him noticed. He didn't drink. He sprang to his feet, tucked the leather briefcase beneath his arm, thanked Ambrose 3 times in succession in a voice that had lost all its steadiness, apologized for wasting his time, then turned and hurried toward the door so quickly that he nearly struck the frame. No one in the room asked why. No one in the room dared to watch him leave. The second man was a logistics partner who had brought a report concerning a shipment shortage on the West Coast. He presented it carefully, supplied the figures, offered an explanation, and Ambrose listened from beginning to end without interrupting him once. When the man closed the report, Ambrose asked exactly one question, his voice as mild as though he were asking about the weather. "Have you told anyone else about this?" The other man stammered. He said no, then said yes, then said only the chief accountant, and then he fell silent. Ambrose gave a single nod, rose, and walked to the window. The following morning, that company's name disappeared from the list of partners displayed in the lobby on the first floor of Ashgrove Tower. The entire directory was replaced. The remaining names shifted upward to fill the empty space, and no one in the building ever mentioned it again. The third man was Cyrus Holloway. He didn't sit at the table. Throughout the entire meeting, he stood slightly behind Ambrose's chair and a little to the left, holding a leather-bound notebook and writing steadily in small, precise handwriting. He had followed Ambrose since the days when neither of them had even owned a desk to sit behind. He remembered the names of every man's wife and children in the organization, remembered their birthdays, remembered who avoided which foods, and whenever Ambrose needed a number, Holloway already had it ready before the question was asked. When Bertram Fell left, Holloway was the one who opened the door for him, and he even gave the man a gentle pat on the shoulder and murmured something in a low voice, something that sounded almost like reassurance. Then he stepped back inside, closed the door, and smiled at Ambrose. "He'll find a way," Holloway said. "Men like him always find a way." Ambrose didn't answer. He stood beside the glass, looking down. From that height, the entire financial district of Chicago lay beneath his feet, and farther away, along the waterfront, rows of shipping containers stretched in long, orderly lines. He watched them longer than necessary. Holloway stood behind him, waiting, his notebook still open, the tip of his pen suspended in the middle of a line, and his face still wore the composure of a man who had stood in that place for too many years to need to ask any questions. "There's a fundraising event on the 60th floor tomorrow night," he said. "The Ashford family is bringing their daughter as well. Would you like me to revise the guest list?" Ambrose continued looking down at the water. "No," he said. "Leave it as it is." The fundraising event began after darkness had completely settled beyond the glass, and Lake Michigan had become nothing more than a flat expanse of black. The cleaning crew had been sent upstairs to provide additional support for the event, and Delia Marsh was among them, not to mop the floors, but to remain along the outer edge of the room, collecting glasses, wiping moisture from the stone, and keeping everything looking as though no one had ever passed through. It was the kind of work that, when done well, no one ever noticed was being done at all. She made her way around the edge of the reception hall, avoiding the clusters of guests, always keeping her eyes lowered just beneath their line of sight, and in the breast pocket of her uniform was the dark blue ballpoint pen she had pressed firmly into place before leaving home. Camille Ashford stood near the group of sofas in the center of the hall, surrounded by 4 or 5 friends, her own age, holding her third glass of wine. She was 26, the daughter of Warren Ashford, and at gatherings like this, she didn't have to do anything except talk, because every time she finished speaking, the circle around her laughed. Delia passed behind them to collect an abandoned glass from the window ledge. She moved slowly, keeping just enough distance between herself and the group. But at that exact moment, Camille turned to answer a joke. Her elbow swung outward, the glass tilted, and wine spilled in a dark streak from her hip, almost to the hem of her silk dress. The group fell silent. Camille looked down at the stain, then she looked up. Only one person stood behind her, wearing a gray-blue uniform and holding an empty glass, and Camille stared directly at her. "What did you do?" Delia opened her mouth to say that she hadn't touched anyone, but before the words could take shape, she heard her own voice say something else. "I'm sorry, ma'am." It was a reflex. 10 years in this line of work had taught her that those words had to leave her mouth before she even had time to think. "Do you know how much this dress cost?" Camille asked. She didn't shout. She spoke calmly, and it was that very calmness that made every one of her friends immediately turn inward, with no one walking away. "I'll get a cloth and solvent right now," Delia said. "It'll only take a minute. You don't need to go anywhere." Camille pointed to the floor directly in front of her shoes. "Clean it here, now." Delia stood motionless for a beat. In that beat, she could clearly hear the string music at the far end of the hall, the clink of glasses at a table across the room, and the sound of herself swallowing. Then she set the empty glass on the window ledge, lowered herself onto one knee on the stone floor, and began wiping the wine with nothing but her bare hand, the hem of the silk dress lying in her palm, heavy and slick and cold. She wiped downward, carefully, trying not to pull too hard. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Camille didn't answer. She stood straight, with her chin slightly raised, looking down at Delia with the gaze of someone waiting to see how much smaller another human being could make herself. One of her friends let out a brief laugh, then quickly covered her mouth. Someone raised a phone, then lowered it again. Delia kept wiping. "I'm sorry." The stain didn't disappear. It only spread wider and sank deeper into the silk fibers, changing from dark red to a murky brown beneath the chandelier light. Delia stopped. She knew exactly what was happening to the fabric, because she had removed hundreds of stains like it from tablecloths, curtains, and upholstered chairs, and she had learned that some things were only damaged further the more they were rubbed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said for the 4th time, and then she stood. She rose slowly, brushed off her knee, and once she was upright, she spoke very softly, so softly that only the people in the nearest circle could hear her. "This stain needs solvent, ma'am. Any more rubbing will damage the silk." For the next 2 seconds, no one said anything. Then one of Camille's friends let out a very quiet, "Oh," the sound people made when they had just heard someone say something true. Camille heard it. She heard it clearly. Blood rushed into her face, not because of the dress, but because everyone around her had just watched a woman in a gray-blue uniform rise from the floor and tell her that she was doing something wrong. Camille didn't say another word. She turned and walked straight toward the restroom, and the circle of people scattered behind her. Delia bent down, picked up the empty glass from the window ledge, and continued making her rounds. In the corner of the hall, beside the entrance to the service stairs, Hollis Draper stood with one shoulder against the wall. He had been there from the beginning. He watched Camille disappear from sight, then looked toward Delia, pulled the black notebook from his coat pocket, turned to a page, and wrote a single line. Then he closed the notebook, slipped the pen into his pocket, and walked down the stairs. Ambrose Kessler stood in the water, about 4 steps from Delia, and he didn't quicken his pace. He took 1 step at a time, the water rolling away from him in small waves toward her. The sleeves of his white shirt soaked dark all the way to his elbows, and he didn't look down at his feet even once. Delia stood there with both hands pressed tightly against her chest, and in her palms was the dark blue ballpoint pen, its plastic casing scratched, one side of its cap worn smooth. She gripped it so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She couldn't think of anything at all. She could think only of one thing. "Don't let it fall again." He stopped in front of her. At that distance, she could finally see him clearly, and he could see her clearly as well. He looked at the gray-blue uniform clinging to her body, at her bare feet beneath the water, at the 2 hands clutching something tightly against her chest, and at her face, the face of a woman doing everything she could not to break apart in front of 47 people. No one on the shore was laughing anymore, but no one walked away either. They remained exactly where they were, and that silence weighed more heavily than the laughter had moments before. Delia spoke first. She used the voice she had used for 10 years, the voice that came out before she even had time to think. "I'm sorry." Ambrose said nothing. "Those glasses," she continued, and her voice began to tremble, not from the cold. "I'll pay for them. I don't know how much they cost, but I'll pay. You can deduct it from my wages, for as long as it takes." He still said nothing. He raised one hand, and Delia drew back half a step, a reflex she couldn't control, but he didn't touch her. He simply removed his drenched suit jacket, gave it a shake to let some of the water run off, then placed it over her shoulders, pulled the 2 sides together in front of her, and let go. The jacket was heavy, wet, and cold. It didn't make her any warmer, but it covered the uniform clinging to her body in front of 30 raised phones, and they both knew that was what it was truly meant to do. Delia lifted her eyes to him. It was the first time in 3 years that she had looked directly into the face of anyone in that tower. "What's your name?" he asked. Delia couldn't answer. It wasn't because she hadn't heard him. She had heard him perfectly. The question was so simple that it hardly seemed like a question at all, and that was precisely why it left her frozen in the water. Something inside her mind had just slipped out of place. She had passed through the revolving doors in the first-floor lobby thousands of times. She had cleaned 42 floors of this tower. She had pressed herself against walls to make room for people on their way to meetings, wiped up the coffee they spilled, cleaned the rooms after they left, picked up the things they dropped, and placed them neatly back on their desks. She knew their names, knew who drank coffee without sugar, knew who often left their glasses behind on the conference room table. And in all those 3 years, not one person in this tower had ever asked her the question he had just asked. Her throat tightened. She tried to swallow, and she felt the tears rise so quickly that she had to blink hard twice. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. "Delia," she said. Her voice was so faint that she could barely hear it herself. "Delia Marsh." Ambrose nodded once, very slowly. "Delia," he said, "are you hurt anywhere?" She shook her head. He held out his hand, palm facing upward, and he didn't hurry her. He simply kept it there and waited. Delia looked at that hand. Then she moved the pen into her left hand, held it tightly, and reached out with her right. Her fingers were stiff with cold and trembling uncontrollably. He took her hand in his, firmly, but without squeezing hard enough to hurt. He guided her toward the shallow steps at the end of the pool, moving slowly so she could place one foot on each step without slipping, and when she emerged from the water, he still didn't let go. They walked through the crowd. Water streamed from the hems of his trousers, from his shirt sleeves, and from the suit jacket around her shoulders, leaving a long, dark trail across the polished marble floor. 47 people moved aside without anyone telling them to. Some hurriedly slipped their phones into their pockets. Some turned their faces away. Some lowered their eyes to the wine glasses in their hands, as though they had suddenly discovered something remarkably interesting there. No one laughed. No one said a word. And in the middle of that silence, Ambrose Kessler led the woman who cleaned the tower's floors across the entire length of the 60th floor reception hall, past every one of them, slowly, without looking at anyone, until the elevator doors closed behind them. The security control room was located on the mezzanine above the main lobby, a narrow room with 3 rows of monitors covering an entire wall. Ambrose entered with the legs of his trousers still wet, and in less than 2 minutes, the room was packed with people. The security shift supervisor sat at the keyboard, his hands trembling slightly. Warren Ashford stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who had merely happened to be passing by. Camille stood beside her father with her arms folded across her chest. Delia had been taken down to the medical room in the basement, wrapped in a blanket, and she wasn't there. "Pull up the time surrounding the incident in the pool area," Ambrose said. The supervisor typed. The main screen displayed the timeline from the 60th floor camera, a gray band stretching across the screen, and in the middle of that band was a blank space. He typed again. The same blank space remained. He tried another access route, then a backup server, then the archived copy, and each time the screen returned the same result. There was no data. It wasn't a corrupted file. It wasn't a recording failure. That entire stretch of time had been erased, cleanly, without a single fragment left behind. "Sir," the supervisor said, his voice going dry, "this section is blank." Someone in the room exhaled. Warren Ashford moved half a step forward. 3 or 4 voices began speaking at once. One person asked whether the footage might have been overwritten, another asked when the system had been installed, and someone else said that something similar had once happened in their old building. And among those voices, one voice rose very softly, no louder than anyone else's, with no emphasis placed on any word. "The system probably malfunctioned," Cyrus Holloway said. He was still standing slightly behind Ambrose, the leather-bound notebook closed in his hand. No one turned to look at him. The sentence drifted among all the others and sank out of sight, and the shift supervisor nodded as though someone had just given him an explanation he could hold on to. Then Camille began to cry. She cried very softly, her hands gripping her own elbows, her shoulders trembling in waves, and when her father placed a hand against her back, she looked up with reddened eyes. "I didn't want to say anything," she said. "I truly didn't. I was going to let the whole thing go." She drew in a trembling breath. She was walking behind me. When I turned around, She was already right there. I only stepped aside, that was all. And then she bumped into me, and I nearly fell into the water with her. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She was already angry with me before that. Because of the dress. I told her I was letting it go. Someone in the room nodded. Someone said they had seen what happened with the dress as well. Someone else said the area had been crowded at the time, and it was difficult to tell who had bumped into whom. The atmosphere inside that narrow room began to tilt, slowly and steadily, like a floor gradually sloping downward. Warren Ashford said that he didn't want to make a large matter out of it, that service employees made mistakes from time to time, and that if Kessler thought it was appropriate, his family was prepared to let the matter go. Ambrose said nothing. He stared at the empty space in the timeline, and he stared at it for a very long time. Then there was a knock at the door. Otis Bell stood on the threshold in his dark blue maintenance uniform, holding a small cloth bag. He was 63 years old, with closely cropped silver hair, and he remained there waiting until someone told him to come in. "I'm sorry to disturb you, gentlemen," he said. "I'm Otis Bell, from maintenance. I heard the camera footage up here couldn't be used." The shift supervisor started to say something, but Ambrose raised one hand. "Go ahead." "There are 2 systems in this building," Otis said. "The one you're looking at belongs to the building. The other one doesn't." He placed the cloth bag on the desk, loosened the drawstring, and took out a dashboard camera small enough to fit in his palm. Its black plastic casing was covered in dust, and silver tape had been wrapped around its edges. "This is mounted on the cab of the window washing rig on the east side of the building. The lens points inward because that rig runs so close to the glass that it sees inside more clearly than it sees outside." No one in the room spoke. "A few years ago, one of the men on our crew had an accident while working on the north rig," Otis continued. "The company said he hadn't followed procedure. He said that wasn't true, but he had nothing to prove it. So that was where the matter ended." He placed the camera on the desk beside the keyboard. "After that happened, the men on the crew pooled their own money and bought this. It isn't connected to any system. It records directly onto a removable memory card, and that card is in my shirt pocket." He raised his eyes and looked slowly around the room, from one person to the next. "We installed it because no one believes the word of a window washer. We haven't needed to use it once in 3 years. He removed the memory card and placed it in the security supervisor's palm. No one in the room moved. The supervisor inserted the card into the reader, pressed 2 keys, and the large screen on the wall went dark for a beat before lighting up again. The image that appeared on the screen looked nothing like anything the people in that room had been waiting to see. It had been recorded from outside the glass, from high above at a downward angle, and because the camera lens was exposed to the open air, a thin veil of mist had gathered along the edge of the frame before slowly fading away. Through that glass, the entire lobby on the 60th floor came into view with an almost unnatural clarity. The security shift supervisor slowed the footage down. On the screen, someone in a blue-gray uniform walked along the edge of the pool, carrying a crate of glasses in both arms. Camille Ashford stood a few steps away with a group of friends. As the uniformed worker approached, Camille stepped backward, then turned half her body to the left, just enough to block the path. She didn't reach out. She didn't touch anyone. She simply stood there with her chin slightly raised, and there was something on her face that anyone who had ever been deliberately blocked from passing would have recognized at once. But at the far left edge of the frame, another figure entered. That person didn't come from the direction of the pool. He came up from the passage leading to the service elevator, moving quickly, cutting diagonally behind the uniformed worker, and in the brief instant, when the 2 figures overlapped, his right hand reached out, landed between Delia Marsh's shoulder blades, and pushed. Then he didn't stop. He kept walking straight ahead without looking back, and disappeared from the frame at the right edge, while behind him, the crate of glasses flew from Delia's hands, and the entire lobby turned toward the commotion. The shift supervisor rewound the footage, enlarged the image, and stopped it on the exact frame where the hand touched the back of her uniform. The man's face appeared clearly beneath the chandelier light spilling through the glass. In the control room, no one was breathing heavily anymore. "Give me a name," Ambrose said. The shift supervisor typed into the personnel system, and a file appeared on the secondary monitor. "Employee photograph, job title, date of hire, Hollis Draper," he read aloud. "Night shift supervisor, sanitation crew, Meridian contractor." A very small sound escaped Camille Ashford. It wasn't a sob, It sounded more like the noise someone makes after missing the final step on a staircase. She looked at the screen, then at her father, then back at the screen again, and beneath her makeup, nothing could conceal the way the color was draining from her face. "I don't know him," she said. No one answered. "I don't know who he is," she said again, louder this time, and now her voice truly broke. "I only stood there. I did block her way, I admit that. I blocked her because I was angry about the dress, and I admit all of it. But I didn't push anyone into the water. I never did." She turned toward Warren Ashford. "Dad," she said. He didn't look at her. He stared straight at the screen, his jaw clenched tight, and he didn't say a single word. Camille stood there with one hand still half raised, and it was her father's silence, not the footage, that finally broke her. She stepped backward, leaned her shoulder against the wall, and said nothing more. Ambrose didn't look at her. He turned to the security shift supervisor and said 3 words. "Bring him up." Hollis Draper was brought into the control room less than 10 minutes later. He was still wearing his supervisor's uniform jacket, buttoned all the way to the collar, and as he crossed the threshold, he even tried to offer a polite smile to the people gathered inside. That smile lasted exactly 2 seconds, until he looked up at the large monitor and saw his own hand frozen in the middle of the frame. He didn't say anything. He didn't turn pale, didn't step back, didn't look for the door. He simply straightened his posture, let both arms hang at his sides, and fixed his eyes on some point on the wall behind Ambrose's head. The entire room waited for him to speak. He didn't. Ambrose stepped forward until he stood directly in front of him. He didn't raise a hand, didn't raise his voice, and didn't move any closer than necessary. He simply stood facing Hollis Draper. And when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that the people standing at the far end of the room had to lean forward to hear him. "Who paid you?" Draper didn't answer. In the mezzanine control room of Ashgrove Tower, surrounded by 3 rows of monitors and the steady hum of cooling fans, the night shift supervisor who had signed Delia Marsh's work schedules for 3 years stood motionless like a wall. Ambrose waited. He waited longer than anyone in the room thought he would. Not a sound came. Then he gave a single nod to the 2 security officers standing by the door. They stepped forward, one on each side, and escorted Hollis Draper out. He walked between them with his back straight, and his steps even, and until the door closed behind him, he still hadn't spoken a single word. Otis Bell stood in the corner of the room holding the empty cloth bag, and he was the only person there who didn't watch the door. He was watching Warren Ashford. 3 days later, Delia was summoned to the offices of Meridian Facility Group on the 3rd floor of a low-rise building west of the financial district. The person who received her wasn't a human resources manager but a lawyer, dressed in a gray suit with his hair neatly combed, who placed a clipped packet of documents in front of her, with a pen laid horizontally across the top. He called her Miss Marsh, invited her to sit, and read the opening section aloud in the flat, practiced voice of a man who had read things like this hundreds of times before. Termination of employment. Under the section marked cause, it stated that she had caused a disturbance at a client event, damaged property, and harmed the contractor's reputation. Delia said there was video footage. She said they had found the person who pushed her. She said her own supervisor had been taken away that very night. The lawyer nodded, and when he spoke, his voice sounded almost sympathetic. "What happened with Mr. Draper is Mr. Draper's matter, Miss Marsh. This is yours." He turned to the 2nd page. "You're covered by a union contract. We can't terminate someone under that agreement unless there's a documented incident, you understand. But there was an incident here, and 47 guests witnessed it, so procedurally, your file is clean." He turned the packet toward her and nudged the pen a little closer. "I recommend that you sign. If this drags on, the stated reason will remain in the system, and Meridian holds the cleaning contracts for 7 of the largest towers in this district." Delia looked at the pen. She didn't pick it up. She asked who had requested that the document be prepared, and he replied that he only received files. He didn't create them. She asked who had approved it, and he turned back to the final page, pointed to an empty box labeled Contractor Representative, and said that section would be completed later. She stood up and walked out without signing. 3 days after that, a letter from the Rehabilitation Center arrived at the 4th floor apartment. Junie Marsh's financial assistance for rehabilitation was tied to the employment insurance of her guarantor, and that guarantor no longer had a job. Delia read the letter in the hallway, folded it into quarters, and didn't tape it to the refrigerator door beside the other 9. She slipped it into the pocket of her coat. Warren Ashford's man came the following afternoon. There was only one of them, wearing a black suit, arriving alone and carrying an envelope. He stood at the door until Delia invited him inside, then sat on the plastic chair beside the kitchen table. He didn't look around the apartment even once, something Delia noticed and silently appreciated. He placed the envelope on the table, opened it, and slid a check toward her, along with a typed document. "Mr. Ashford is deeply sorry for what happened to you," he said. "This is personal assistance and has nothing to do with the company. You only need to sign here to confirm that neither party has any further claims against the other." Delia looked at the amount on the check. She looked at it for a very long time. She had sat in that same chair countless times, counting loose change from the cookie tin, and she knew exactly how many therapy sessions the number on that piece of paper represented, how many months, how many steps down a hallway. It was 3 months, 3 full months without worrying, without making phone calls to ask for more time, without watching her sister practice alone while it was still dark outside. She reached out her hand. In the bedroom doorway, Junie stood leaning on one crutch. She didn't say anything. She didn't nod or shake her head. She didn't stop her sister, and she didn't urge her on. She simply stood there watching Delia, and Delia knew exactly why she remained silent, because Junie had calculated that number in exactly the same way she had. Delia rested her hand on the check. Then she pushed it back across the table. "I'm not signing," she said. The man in the black suit raised an eyebrow. "Have you thought this through, miss?" "I have." She pushed it a little farther until the check was fully on his side of the table. "If I sign, then this becomes something that never happened. And if it never happened, then the next person cleaning floors in that building won't have anyone standing up for them." The man sat still for several moments. Then he slipped the check back into the envelope, stood, thanked her for her time, and left. The door closed behind him. Junie made her way over on her crutches, sat down in the chair across from her sister, and neither of them spoke for a very long time. That night, after her sister had fallen asleep, Delia opened the drawer of Junie's desk. The stack of scrap paper lay at the very bottom, blank side facing upward, the edge still wrinkled where it had once been caught. She pulled it out, turned it over, and held it at an angle toward the kitchen light. Columns of numbers, contract codes, and in the middle of the 11th line, that last name. This time, she didn't believe it was a coincidence. The call came in the middle of the morning from a landline number with no name attached, and the person on the other end said only that Mr. Kessler wanted to see her, that a car would be sent to pick her up, and that she didn't need to prepare anything. Delia said she would get there on her own. She took the elevated train to the financial district, walked 3 blocks through the wind, and when she stepped through the revolving doors into the first-floor lobby of Ashgrove Tower, she realized that this was the first time in 3 years she had entered the building through the main entrance. They took her up to the 61st floor. Ambrose was standing beside a long table with his sleeves rolled up, and on the wall in front of him, a screen displayed a data table crowded with row after row of information. He didn't invite her to sit down right away. He asked whether she had eaten anything, then had someone bring up a cup of coffee, and only after she was holding it in her hands did he turn back toward the screen. "I've had people go back through the building's entire system since that night," he said. "Not the cameras. Everything else." He pressed a key. The data table scrolled downward. "These are the operating logs for the office equipment on the 58th floor. Printers, scanners, document shredders. Every time one of those machines reports a malfunction, the system records the time and the badge code of the person who opened the machine to deal with it." He stopped the cursor on one line. "This is the document shredder in the main conference room. 3 nights before the party, it reported a paper jam." The line on the screen was very short. An equipment code, an error code, and in the final column, a string of characters. DM4471. Delia set the coffee cup down on the table. She reached up to her neck, pulled on the lanyard, and turned over the back of her faded access badge. In the lower corner, printed in letters so small that she had never once bothered to read them carefully in 3 years, was that exact same string of characters. She stared at it for a long time. She thought about her cold, stiff fingers pressing the badge against the machine slot in the dark conference room. She thought about the dry click when the machine cover sprang open. She thought about how she had stood there alone, with no one watching, and how she had believed that because no one had seen it, the moment somehow didn't exist. The next day, Ambrose said, someone from Ashford Capital's office asked building operations to produce a copy of the equipment logs for the 58th floor. The request was made in writing. The stated reason was a routine equipment inspection. He turned toward her. They were missing a set of documents, Miss Marsh. They were trying to find out who had been the last person to touch that machine. Delia said nothing. They didn't know whether you'd taken the papers or simply cleared the jam and dropped them into the trash, he continued. And they didn't need to know. What they needed was for you to stop having access to this building. They could figure out the rest afterward. He didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't emphasize a single word. And because of that, the meaning settled inside Delia with an almost unbearable weight. She thought about the shift schedule pinned to the bulletin board on the second basement level. She thought about the black-covered notebook being opened and then closed again. She thought about the 47 people standing around the edge of the pool, the phones raised in the air, the weary remark about calling maintenance, and she realized that for the past 3 days she had believed she had merely been humiliated when what had happened to her had an entirely different name. She bent down, opened her handbag, and took out a stack of papers folded in half, their edges still wrinkled. I kept it, she said. I was going to use the backs as scrap paper for my sister. The other side was still blank. Ambrose looked at the papers in her hand. He didn't immediately reach out to take them. Did you read them? Yes, but I didn't understand any of it. She placed the stack on the table and smoothed it flat with her palm. It was nothing but numbers. Ambrose pulled the papers toward himself. He turned through them one sheet at a time, reading very slowly, while Delia stood beside him and watched his face. It didn't change. Nothing tightened. Nothing drew together. And it was that complete lack of change that made a chill begin to travel down her spine. He reached the final page, then flipped all the way back to the first, and called Cyrus Holloway's name. Holloway entered within half a minute. Ambrose didn't hand him the papers. He simply spoke. Call an independent auditing firm. Not the one we normally use. Find another one. Then he turned to Delia, and this time he spoke to her as though she were in equal standing in the room. These are Ashford Capital's insurance payout records, he said. But none of the beneficiaries listed under these policies ever received the money. The funds leave the account, they're recorded as paid out, and then they circle back somewhere else. He tapped one finger against the edge of the papers. This isn't scrap paper, Miss Marsh. This is something people are willing to push a woman into the water in front of 47 witnesses to get back. The independent auditing firm Ambrose chose had its offices along the southern waterfront, in a row of low buildings wedged between long stacks of shipping containers, and the appointment was set for the evening, because that was when the area was at its emptiest. Delia went alone. She had told him that she wanted to carry the papers there herself, sit down herself, and sign the transfer record with her own hand. And after studying her for a long moment, he had agreed. Sleet had begun falling that afternoon. By the time she stepped out of the auditing office with the cloth bag slung across her shoulder, the entire yard was lit only by murky yellow floodlights spilling down onto wet concrete, and the passage between 2 rows of containers narrowed into a long, hollow corridor of steel. She heard the footsteps when she was already halfway through. 3 people. They didn't call her name. They simply started walking faster. Delia turned into a gap between 2 rows of containers, then turned again. But the passage ended at a steel wall, and she had to turn back. When she did, they were already standing across the far end, blocking her way. The man in front said Mr. Ashford wanted his property back. Delia told him she didn't have it anymore. He told her to open the bag. She clutched it against her chest. His hand seized the strap. She yanked it back. And for the next few seconds, there was nothing but the scrape of shoes sliding across wet concrete, the sound of fabric tearing open, the bag hitting the ground, and everything inside spilling out and rolling across the pavement. A wallet, a ring of keys, a pillbox, and a transfer receipt folded into quarters. The man bent down and picked up the receipt. Delia lunged toward him. Her shoulder slammed into the side of a container, and the impact rang through the steel corridor, long and hollow, echoing back in layer after layer before finally dying away. Then headlights swept across them. The entire corridor of steel suddenly flooded with white light, and all 3 men turned, raising their hands to shield their eyes. 3 black SUVs stopped at the entrance to the passage, their doors opening at the same time. No one shouted. No one spoke. There was only the sound of shoes striking the wet ground, quick and even, as Ambrose's men closed in from both sides. It ended faster than Delia could understand what was happening. One man was pinned against the side of a container. Another had both arms locked behind his back and was forced down. And the third, the man who had been leading them, dropped the transfer receipt and lowered himself onto his knees on the concrete before anyone even touched him. Then everything went still. There was only the soft patter of sleet against the vehicle roofs and the low hum of engines idling. Ambrose stepped out of the second SUV. He went to Delia first, not to the three men. He picked up her keys and wallet from the ground, brushed the water from them, and handed them back. Then he took off his black wool coat and draped it over her shoulders. And this time she didn't step away. "Are you hurt?" "No," she lied, and they both knew it. He turned toward the man kneeling on the concrete. The man kept his head bowed, his shoulders trembling from the cold, melted sleet running down the back of his collar. Ambrose's men stood around him, waiting. No one moved. In that entire container yard, across that whole stretch of waterfront, at that hour, there wasn't another person anywhere nearby. Ambrose looked at the man for a while. Then he turned back and spoke to Delia. "What do you want me to do with him?" The silence after the question lasted so long that some of his men glanced at one another. In all the years they had known him, no one had ever heard Ambrose Kessler ask anyone's opinion before making a decision. Not his lawyer, not Cyrus Holloway. No one. Delia stood there with the heavy wool coat resting over her shoulders, looking at the man kneeling in front of her. He was about Wesley's age. She thought about the ballpoint pen in the breast pocket of her shirt. She thought about a man who had once worked the night shift in a warehouse along a waterfront not very far from here. And she thought that if someone had acted then in the way things might have been handled tonight, even now no one would know what the truth had been. "Let him go," she said. Ambrose's men didn't move. They waited for him. "Let him go," Delia said again. "Then call the police. Document everything. Give them that transfer receipt too." She pulled the coat more tightly around her shoulders. "I don't want to live in a city where whoever is stronger gets to be right. I've already lived that way for 2 years. Ambrose didn't answer immediately. He stood there for a long time, sleet gathering on the shoulders of his shirt, his eyes lowered toward the wet concrete. Then he gave a single nod, and his men released their hold. On the drive home, the car passed beneath row after row of yellow floodlights, and Delia sat in the back seat watching them slide by one at a time. "I'll put 2 men outside your building," Ambrose said. "Only at night." "Don't." He turned toward her. "Don't," she said again. "I'm grateful for what you did tonight, but if you leave people there, then every morning I wake up, I'll owe you 1 more day. I already owe too many people." She looked straight at him. "I want to go home on my own." Ambrose watched her for a moment. Then he turned back toward the front and spoke to the driver. "Pull everyone away from Miss Marsh's building." The lights went out long after darkness had already settled outside. It wasn't the kind of outage where everything flickered and then came back on the way it had before. The entire building went dark at once. The hallway lights, the stairwell lights, the fire indicators at the end of every floor, all of them disappearing in the same instant, and the refrigerator in the kitchen stopped humming, leaving behind a silence so thick that Delia could hear the blood beating in her ears. She stood still in the kitchen, a dish towel still in her hand. In this neighborhood, every power outage always came with voices. Someone swore downstairs. A door opened somewhere. A child called for their mother. This time there was nothing. Then she heard footsteps on the main staircase. More than one person, even steps, unhurried, and no one calling anyone's name. Delia set the towel down, took 3 steps toward the bedroom, and by the time she reached the doorway, Junie was already sitting upright in bed, one hand reaching toward the 2 crutches propped against the wall. She didn't ask anything. She only looked at her sister through the darkness and gave a single nod. Delia took the coat hanging behind the door, draped it over Junie's shoulders, grabbed the keys, and as she passed the kitchen table, she reached into the bottom drawer and took out the only thing she needed to bring with her. The fire exit was at the end of the hallway, beyond a red-painted steel door with the paint peeling away. The 2 sisters stepped out of the apartment, closed the door as quietly as they could, and moved down the hallway in complete darkness. Delia stayed half a step ahead, one hand against the wall to feel her way, the other hanging free and ready, but she didn't help her sister. She knew Junie wouldn't allow it. The sound of the crutches striking the wooden floor came steadily behind her, then a pause, then another, At the far end of the hallway behind them, the latch on the fourth-floor door snapped open. Delia pushed through the steel door. The emergency staircase inside was a narrow iron cage, spiraling downward, with grated steel steps and a handrail cold enough to sting. There were no windows. There was nothing but darkness and the smell of damp metal. Junie set her right crutch onto the first step, and the impact rang through the entire stairwell, loud and sharp, stretching out in an echo. She stopped. "Sis," she whispered. "It's too loud." "I know." Delia turned back. In the darkness, she couldn't see her sister's face, only hear her breathing, short and quick. "Just keep going. Don't rush. I'll count the rhythm for you." They went down one step at a time. Delia moved backward below her, one hand gripping the rail, and each time the crutch struck the steel grating, she quietly spoke a word so her voice would overlap the sound of metal. They made it past the third floor. They reached halfway down to the second. Above them, about 2 floors up, the steel door on the fourth floor burst open, and a beam of white light swept into the stairwell, moving sideways, then angling down. Delia pulled her sister tightly against the inner wall, into the shadow beneath the landing. The beam passed over their heads, paused for a moment on the handrail, then moved on. A voice carried down from above, too distant to make out the words. Then the footsteps started descending. Delia turned, hurried through the remaining half-flight, and pushed the door at the second-floor landing. It didn't move. She pushed again, harder this time, with both hands and her shoulder. The door opened only a narrow crack before stopping, and through that gap she saw something on the other side braced across the handle. Someone had blocked it from outside. Junie stood above her, looking down. She didn't say anything. She only turned her head toward the sound of the footsteps coming closer. "Up," Delia said. They went back the way they had come. It was the longest distance Delia Marsh had ever traveled in her life. Up past the third floor, up to the fourth-floor landing, where the steel door was still slightly open and the flashlight beam had moved away. Then higher. On the fifth floor, the door leading into the hallway was tightly shut, but beside it, at the far end of the landing, there was a smaller, unpainted door leading into the building's mechanical room. It was open. Otis Bell stood there holding a hurricane lantern, keeping the light low near the floor. He didn't say anything. He simply stepped aside and lifted one hand in a signal. The two sisters went inside, and he closed the door behind them, turned the lock, then dragged a steel tool cabinet across it. Inside the mechanical room, the water pumps rumbled loudly enough to swallow every other sound. Otis set the lantern on the floor, and only then, in that pool of yellow light, could Delia see her sister's face. Pale, hair stuck to her forehead, but both hands still gripping the crutches tightly. "Why are you here?" Delia asked. "I still come through this neighborhood once a week," Otis said. "The heater here has been broken all season, so I stopped by to help some of the families downstairs." He glanced toward the door. The power for the whole building was cut at the main box outside. It wasn't a failure. Delia nodded. She didn't call Ambrose. She had told him to pull all his people away from her building, and he had done exactly that. "And little Pearl," Otis said quietly, as though he could read the thought moving through her mind. "Her mother picked her up this afternoon, across the river. She's all right." Then he sat down on the wooden chair beside the wall and pulled an old tin box toward himself from the top of the tool cabinet. The tin had once held cookies, much like the one on Delia's kitchen table, but one corner of its lid was dented, and the picture printed on the outside had faded so badly that there was no longer any way to tell what it had once been. Otis set it on his knees, lifted the lid, and in the yellow glow of the hurricane lantern, Delia saw papers inside. Not many, just a thin stack, laid flat, the edges already yellowed to ivory. "I call these the things people leave behind," Otis said. 3 years working in this building. Anything people forgot that I thought was worth keeping, I kept. Most of it is nonsense, but some of it isn't." He pulled a sheet of paper from the bottom and handed it to her. It was a handwritten petition on graph paper, written in blue ink, each opening letter carefully capitalized. Across the top was a title, "Petition regarding the fire alarm system at Warehouse Number 7, West Waterfront District." Beneath it were about 10 lines of text, written in the plain language of men who weren't accustomed to drafting formal documents, explaining that the alarm in the rear section had failed to sound during 3 consecutive drills, that the emergency light at passage number 2 had been broken since summer, that people worked the night shift in that area, and that they were requesting a full inspection of the entire system. Below that were signatures. They filled 2 columns and nearly covered the page. Some were written entirely in capital letters. Some were little more than a jagged line. Some men had even written their shift numbers beside their names. Delia counted them. 31 names. She read from top to bottom, slowly, and when she reached the lower part of the second column, her hands began to tremble. The final signature sat on the bottom line at the far right. It began with a heavy, clear stroke, then started fading after the 3rd letter, and by the final 2 letters the ink had nearly vanished altogether, leaving only the indentation of the pen tip pressed hard into the paper, deep, determined, but producing no ink. Wesley Marsh. Delia raised a hand to the breast pocket of her shirt. She took out the ballpoint pen, its dark blue plastic casing scratched, one side of the cap worn smooth, and laid it beside the petition. She couldn't say a word. She sat there with one hand holding the paper and the other resting on the pen, her head bowed so low that her shoulders shook in waves beneath the steady roar of the water pumps. Junie came over on her crutches and sat beside her sister. She didn't say anything. She simply placed one hand on Delia's back and left it there. A very long time passed before Delia finally lifted her head. "This petition," she said, her voice raw and hoarse. "Did anyone ever receive it?" "No." Otis looked down at the tin on his knees. "It made it as far as the regional manager's desk, and that's where it stopped. No written response. No one came down to inspect anything. After that, I don't know what happened." "Then why do you have it?" Otis didn't answer right away. He reached out, took hold of the edge of the paper, and pointed to the signature directly above Wesley Marsh's name. The handwriting leaned slightly, slow and deliberate, the kind of writing made by someone more accustomed to filling out invoices than formal petitions. "Because I was number 30, he said. Delia looked at the name. "Otis Bell. I worked the night shift at warehouse number 7 before I came to this tower," he said. 19 years. I knew that warehouse better than I knew my own home. I knew which alarms didn't sound, which emergency lights only flickered for a moment before going dark. The night shift boys wrote that petition together in the break room. We rewrote it 3 times just to get the wording right, then passed it around for everyone to sign. He paused. Wesley was the last one to sign. He carried that pen around through all 30 men, before it finally came to his turn. By the time it reached him, the pen had run dry. In the mechanical room, only the sound of the water pumps remained. He kept pressing down, kept trying. Otis said, "I told him I'd get another pen." He said, "Never mind. They could still read it like this." Then he put the pen in his shirt pocket. Otis folded the paper slowly along the old creases. 3 weeks later, I got promoted to the maintenance crew at the tower in the financial district. Better pay, day shift, decent insurance. I transferred out. I took this petition with me because I thought once I got up there, I'd find a way to put it in the hands of somebody with more authority. He raised his eyes and looked at Delia for the first time since opening the tin. Then that night happened, and I was 14 miles away, asleep in my own bed. Otis placed the petition back inside the tin, but he didn't close the lid. "Do you know why every night I read out the full first and last name of every person on the crew, Miss Marsh?" he said. "For decades, everybody's thought I was just getting senile." He shook his head. "Those 31 names on this paper have never been read aloud even once. Nobody in any of those buildings ever knew who they were. I was only afraid I'd forget, too." Delia sat without moving. She thought of all the evenings he had divided his sandwiches with her. She thought of the way he always said her name, first and last, never once getting it wrong. She had believed it was kindness. "You've helped me for 3 years, she said. "Not because you felt sorry for me. No." Otis looked down at the tin in his hands. "Because I owe them. Those other 30 men signed beside me, and I was the one who got out 3 weeks early." He closed the lid. "There are some debts you can't repay to the people you owe them to. You can only repay them to the ones who are still alive." A copy of the petition was sent to the 61st floor the following morning. Ambrose read it twice, then called the records department and requested every budget file from the West Waterfront District covering the period in which warehouse number 7 appeared by name. 4 cardboard boxes were brought up. He sat with them all day, alone, allowing no one into the room, and by the time darkness had settled beyond the glass, he found it. A single-page document. A list of operating cost reductions. 11 items in all. with the 7th item covering maintenance and upgrades to the fire alarm and fire protection systems at 3 warehouses in the West Waterfront District. The amount saved was stated clearly. In the lower right corner was a signature. It was his. Ambrose placed the page on the table and stared at it for a very long time. The first stroke leaned at exactly the right angle. The hook at the end curved in exactly the right direction. The spacing between the 2 letters matched the way he always wrote them. There was only one problem. He had never signed it. He remembered that period clearly. He remembered where he had been, what he had been doing, and he remembered that the entire West Waterfront Warehouse Operations Division had been handed over to someone else to manage, with limited authority to sign on his behalf, so he wouldn't have to look at it anymore. He called a document examiner at midnight. They arrived within an hour carrying magnifying lenses and scanners, and they worked in silence until nearly dawn. The conclusion wasn't long. The signature was a copied signature, produced by tracing from an original. Whoever had done it was highly skilled and had practiced many times. The ink and the paper matched supplies used internally by the organization. The examiner handed him another page, printed from the digital record system. It was an access log for the camera server at Ashgrove Tower. During the window when all footage from the 60th floor disappeared, only one account had logged into that partition. Ambrose looked at the name printed on both pages. Cyrus Holloway. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He didn't call anyone. He sat motionless at the head of the long table in the room that appeared on no blueprint, and let the years run backward through his mind one by one. Holloway had been beside him since the days when both of them slept in warehouses. He was the man who remembered the names of every wife and child connected to everyone in the organization. He was the man who had opened the door for Bertram Fell and given him a pat on the shoulder as he walked out. He was the first person to say the system had probably failed. And 11 years earlier, at the cemetery south of the city, he had been the man standing to the left of Ambrose's mother's coffin, holding an umbrella over him through the entire service, because it had been raining that day, and Ambrose hadn't brought anything with him. Near dawn, the independent auditors sent over a preliminary report on Ashford Capital's insurance payout records. Money left the fund, was recorded as paid to beneficiaries, then returned through 3 intermediary layers, before ending in an account under the name of a consulting company with no employees. The person listed as the owner of that company had been taking money for years. Among the locations selected for cost reductions and false maintenance contracts were 3 warehouses, and warehouse number 7 was the farthest away, the oldest, and the least visited. In the file, there was a handwritten note in the margin, stating that no personnel were assigned to the rear section at night. Ambrose read that note and sat still for a very long time. Then he stood, walked to the low cabinet against the wall, and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a pale blue plastic lunchbox, one side of the handle broken, the lid yellowed with age. He took it out, placed it on the table, and opened it. Inside there was only a small piece of graph paper folded into quarters, torn from a little notebook. He had kept it for 11 years and had never once opened it. He opened it now. Rosalind Kessler had worked as a night shift janitor at a hospital south of the city for 18 years. She left for work when her son went to bed and came home when he was leaving for school, and throughout all those years she had never taken more than 4 consecutive days off. She cleaned the 3rd and 4th floor hallways, the inpatient wards, and she knew the names of every nurse on the night shift, even though none of them knew hers. In winter, the skin across her knuckles cracked from cleaning chemicals, red all the way to her wrists, and she rubbed on a cheap ointment from the corner drugstore before pulling on wool gloves to sleep. Ambrose remembered holding those hands when he was a boy, and he remembered how rough they felt, like sandpaper. The note inside the lunchbox contained only 3 lines, written in slightly slanted handwriting. She wrote that she had gone to work, that the food in the refrigerator only needed to be reheated, and that he should never make anyone bow their head before him. He read those 3 lines again and again. Then he folded the paper along its old creases and placed it back inside the lunchbox. He stood, walked to the glass, and looked down at the city below. He had built this tower higher than everything around it, so high that from up here there was no longer any way to tell one neighborhood from another. It wasn't until that night that he finally understood why he had built it so high. He had everything sent to her, not a summary, not an account relayed through an assistant, but the entire file, placed inside a hard case, with a handwritten note from him saying that she had the right to read it before he did anything else. Delia read it at the kitchen table in her 4th floor apartment, beneath the yellow light, while Junie slept in the next room. She read slowly, 1 page at a time, and she read the cost reduction list 3 times. Item 7. 3 warehouses in the West Waterfront District. The amount was written clearly, neat and rounded, contained within a single line. The next morning, she went up to the 61st floor. Ambrose was standing beside the glass when she entered, and he turned around immediately. He didn't walk toward her. "Have you read all of it?" "Yes." She placed the hard case on the long table, and she didn't sit down. "I have a few questions." "Ask them." "That signature was forged." "Yes, but the authority for him to sign in your name was real." Ambrose didn't answer. Immediately, "It was." "What year did you give him that authority?" He gave her a span of time, measured in years. "In all those years, did you ever open a single document to see what he was signing?" Ambrose looked at her. He could have said that at the time he had been trying to manage 20 other things at once. He could have said that everyone in his position did the same thing. He could have said that if a man couldn't trust the person closest to him, he couldn't run anything at all. He said none of it. "No," he said. Delia gave one small nod. She reached across the table, opened the case, pulled out the cost reduction list, placed it on top, and turned it toward him. "Do you know what this 7th line means?" she said. "It means the alarm in the back of that warehouse stayed silent through 3 fire drills, and nobody fixed it. It means the emergency light at passage number 2 had been broken since summer and nobody replaced it. It means 31 men sat in a break room and rewrote a petition 3 times so the words would be right, then passed it from hand to hand, signed it, sent it in, and waited." Her voice remained steady. That was what made it harder to hear than anything else. No one answered them. No one came down to inspect anything. That petition sat on somebody's desk, and that was the end of it. She took the ballpoint pen from the breast pocket of her shirt and placed it beside the paper. "My husband was the last man to sign." By the time it reached him, the pen had run out of ink. He kept pressing down until the paper was indented, because he thought they would still be able to read it that way. Ambrose looked at the pen. He didn't reach for it. "For 2 years, Delia said. "I've gone to 4 different offices. I've called the insurance people more than 20 times. They told me his contract was temporary, that his case wasn't eligible for payment, that if I disagreed, I should get a lawyer. I didn't have money for a lawyer. I cleaned floors at night and worked at a laundromat during the day, and I sat counting loose change in a cookie tin to find enough money for my sister's therapy." She raised her eyes. "For those entire 2 years, I kept thinking there was no one responsible. I thought it was just bad luck. That's what people told me, and I believed them because I had no way not to believe them." The room was very quiet. "Now I know there was." Ambrose didn't move. "I know you didn't sign it," she said. "I believe the document examiner's conclusion. I believe you didn't know." She drew in a breath. "But that system had your name on it. You were the one who gave him that authority, and in all those years, you never opened it once to look, because you didn't need to. Because that warehouse was too far down, too far away, and from up here, it was only 1 line on a cost sheet." She picked up the pen and slipped it back into her breast pocket. "You pulled me out of the water," she said. "I'll remember that for the rest of my life. But you're also the reason I had to stay down there alone for the last 2 years." Ambrose stood still. He looked at her, and he didn't offer a single word. No explanation, no apology, no promise of any kind. He simply stood there and accepted everything she had just said, standing straight, never looking away from her, like a man who understood that the only thing he could still do for her in that moment was not argue. Delia closed the hard case and pushed it across the table toward him. "Do what you have to do," she said. "I won't stop you, but don't do it for me. I don't want to be another name on the list of people you owe." She turned away. She walked the full length of the room, and he didn't call her back. He didn't take a single step after her. He remained exactly where he was beside the glass, the hard case resting on the long table in front of him, and he watched her until the door closed behind her. The meeting was scheduled for late the following afternoon in the main conference room on the 58th floor, and the invitation that went out contained only 1 short line about reviewing the joint venture agreement. Ambrose arrived before everyone else. He was standing at the head of the room when the door opened and Delia walked in. He didn't ask why she had come back. She went straight to him, opened her hand, and in her palm lay the dark blue ballpoint pen. "Take this in with you," she said. Ambrose looked at it. It belonged to my husband. He didn't get to finish what he was trying to say. He held out his hand, and she placed the pen in his palm. She said nothing more. She turned around and left, and she didn't stay. Warren Ashford arrived with his private attorney and 2 men from his company. Cyrus Holloway came last, exactly as he always did, the leather-bound notebook tucked beneath his arm, and he pulled out the chair to Ambrose's right and sat down in the same place where he had sat for 11 years. The conference room door remained open. No one closed it. Ambrose sat at the head of the table, and he placed something on the wooden surface in front of him. A dark blue plastic ballpoint pen, scratched, its cap worn smooth along one side. He didn't say anything about it. He simply set it down in the middle of the empty space between Holloway and Warren Ashford, then withdrew his hand. Warren Ashford glanced at the pen, then at Ambrose, then sat up straighter. "Shall we begin?" he said. "One thing first." Ambrose nodded toward the technician standing in the corner. The large screen on the wall came to life, but it wasn't showing documents. It showed this very room, filmed from the camera mounted on the ceiling, and in the lower right corner of the screen, a small line of red text blinked steadily. Beneath it was the name of the location receiving the feed. "Main lobby, 1st floor. It's the end of the workday," Ambrose said. "There are about 200 people downstairs waiting for elevators and buses. The cleaning crew just started their shift. The maintenance crew just finished theirs." He placed both hands on the table. "This entire meeting is being broadcast to the large screen in the lobby." A chair shifted in the room. Warren Ashford's attorney started to stand, then sat back down. "You aren't authorized to do this," he said. "This is my building," Ambrose said, "and no one is being kept here. The door is open. You can leave whenever you want." No one stood up. Ambrose opened the file and began to read, slowly, clearly, leaving out nothing. He read the document examiner's conclusion about the signature on the cost reduction list. He read the name of the person who had done it. He read the camera server access log from the period when the footage from the 60th floor disappeared, and he read the only account that had logged into that partition. He read the independent auditor's preliminary report on the money leaving Ashford Capital's insurance fund, the 3 intermediary layers, and the name of the consulting company with no employees. He read the name of the man behind that company. Cyrus Holloway sat motionless. He didn't stand. He didn't object. He only raised one hand and adjusted the leather-bound notebook in front of him until it lay parallel with the edge of the table, then stared straight at the screen on the wall, where the image of his own face was being transmitted to 200 people on the 1st floor. "Do you have anything to say?" Ambrose asked. Holloway didn't answer. 31 men signed a petition, Ambrose said. They asked for the fire alarm in the rear section of warehouse number 7 to be repaired. That petition made it as far as the regional manager's desk and stopped there. At the same time, the fire protection maintenance contracts for 3 warehouses in the West Waterfront District were cut, and the amount saved was recorded on a list bearing my signature. He paused. There is one handwritten line in the margin of that file. It says that no personnel were assigned to the rear section at night. He looked directly at Holloway. There were. Warren Ashford shoved his chair backward. "I'm not listening to any more of this," he said. He stood. His attorney stood with him, and all 4 men on his side headed for the door. Ambrose didn't stop them. No one did. They made it into the hallway, turned toward the elevators, and stopped there. 200 people were standing in the 1st floor lobby beneath the large screen, and the elevators went down to the 1st floor lobby. Warren Ashford stood in front of the elevator doors for a long time. Then he turned and looked back toward the conference room, and in that moment Ambrose saw on his face the thing he had been waiting for all afternoon. It wasn't fear. It was the calculation of a man who had just realized there was no back door. Cyrus Holloway remained exactly where he was. He looked at the empty ballpoint pen lying on the table in front of him, and he stared at it for a very long time, until the sound of police footsteps began coming down the hallway. The envelope arrived by ordinary mail, addressed to the office of the independent auditing firm rather than Ashgrove Tower. There was no sender's name. There was no postmark from any internal mail station. Inside were copies of 3 transfer orders from an Ashford Capital account, routed through 2 intermediary companies, and ending in the account of the consulting firm with no employees that the auditors had already traced, but had not yet been able to match against original documentation. These were those documents. They matched down to every number. Enclosed with them was a handwritten note, the script slanted, written in ink. unsigned. It contained only 3 sentences. I did block her way, and I admit that, but I never pushed anyone into the water. He has let me carry the blame for that for weeks without saying a single word. Someone from the auditing firm brought the note to Ambrose. He read it, set it down, and told no one to investigate who had sent it. 3 days later, during a recorded deposition, Hollis Draper told them everything. He said someone had contacted him by phone, that the money had been transferred in 2 payments, and that the instruction had been very specific. The woman had to be removed from the building through an incident witnessed by a large number of people, because her union record didn't allow her contract to be terminated any other way. He said he had watched her for several days, waiting for the right opportunity, and that the opportunity had presented itself when a young woman happened to stand in her way beside the pool over something that had nothing to do with him. He said he didn't know the young woman, had never spoken to her, and had given no one any warning. Camille Ashford didn't appear at the deposition. She didn't appear anywhere else either. People said she had left Chicago, moved to the East Coast, and that none of her old friends had heard from her since. No apology was ever sent to Delia Marsh. No meeting took place. There was only an unnamed envelope and a single written admission of exactly the part she had played. Not one word more. 4 days later, Ambrose Kessler walked into the federal building downtown, carrying 2 metal cases, accompanied by 3 attorneys. Inside those 2 cases were the complete records of the West Waterfront warehouse and port system. Not one ledger missing, not one altered. He turned them over to the federal prosecutor's office and signed the transfer record as a voluntary provider of evidence and a future witness. His lawyers had argued with him for 3 straight days. They told him he could hand over only the material connected to warehouse number 7. They told him that if he surrendered everything, he would lose control of the entire port system, that the operating contracts would be suspended immediately, that half of what he had built over 20 years would disappear within a single quarter. He listened to all of it, and he handed over everything. That afternoon, after it was all finished and the tower had grown quiet, Otis Bell went up to the 61st floor to replace a light bulb in the outer hallway. He finished the job, folded up his ladder, and before leaving, he stopped in the doorway. Ambrose was sitting at the head of the long table, with the empty cardboard boxes in front of him. "May I ask you something, Mr. Kessler?" Otis said. Ambrose nodded. "Those papers you took in this morning," Otis said. "You didn't have to give them all up. Everybody knows you didn't have to give them all up." Ambrose didn't answer right away. He looked down at the table, where the dark blue ballpoint pen still lay exactly where it had been placed. "I didn't hold the pen," he said, "but I gave it to him, and then I turned my back." The old man stood motionless in the doorway, still holding the folded ladder. "For 20 years, I've told myself I had one rule," Ambrose said. "Don't touch people who can't fight back." I guarded that rule carefully. I was proud of it. He raised his eyes. Then I found out that all those years, my name had been traveling down into places my feet had never touched, and it was doing things I would never have permitted. A principle you don't examine isn't a principle. It's only something you tell yourself so you can sleep at night. Otis said nothing. "Don't misunderstand me," Ambrose said. "I'm not doing this so she'll come back." He said it very calmly, and that was what made it hardest to hear. "She won't come back, and I don't have the right to ask her to. I'm doing it because I allowed this to happen." In the room that appeared on no blueprint, surrounded by empty cardboard boxes, there were only 2 men and an empty ballpoint pen lying on the table. At that moment, Delia Marsh was 9 blocks away, sitting on the plastic chair beside her kitchen table, counting again the money left in a tin box, and she heard none of it. 1 year later, the lobby on the 60th floor of Ashgrove Tower was lit again. The same 7-tier chandelier still hung overhead, the same glass wall looked out across the lake, and the same stretch of calm blue water lay flat and still through the center of the lobby. But this time there were no black evening suits, no silk gowns, no one standing in circles with wine glasses in their hands. Chairs had been arranged in rows facing a speaking platform, and most of the people sitting in those rows were wearing uniforms. The blue-gray uniforms of the cleaning crews, the dark blue uniforms of maintenance workers, the reflective jackets worn by the men who worked nights in the parking garage. On the board beside the platform, there was only one line of text: the Rosalind Fund, an accident insurance and scholarship program for night shift workers in the city of Chicago. Delia Marsh stepped onto the platform wearing a navy blue coat, a thin stack of papers in her hand. She began by saying that the fund didn't belong to her, that it belonged to the people who had spent years sitting in basement break rooms writing petitions that no one ever read, and that her only job was to make sure that next time, people wouldn't have to write those petitions at all. She explained the charter, the eligibility requirements, and the procedures, speaking slowly so that even the people in the very last row could follow every word. Then she invited Otis Bell to come up. The old man carried the sheet of graph paper that had yellowed to ivory with age, placed it on the podium, put on his glasses, and said that he only needed 2 minutes. "This is a petition written many years ago," he said. "Nobody ever answered it, but 31 people signed their names here, and I think it's time somebody read those names aloud." Then he began. He read every person's full first and last name, slowly, clearly, exactly the way he had read names every evening in that room on the second basement level. The entire lobby fell silent. Some names made someone in the audience suddenly lift their head. Some names made a woman in the 4th row raise a hand to cover her mouth. When he reached the 31st name, his voice faltered for a single beat. Then he read it in full and folded the paper again along its old creases. In all the 3 years Delia had worked inside that tower, not one of those names had ever been spoken aloud on the 60th floor. In the 2nd row, Junie sat beside Marjorie and her daughter. When the ceremony ended, she stood up using a lightweight aluminum cane, and she walked the entire width of the lobby without stopping once. Little Pearl was 7 years old now, and she had been given the job of carrying a flower basket and handing blossoms to the guests. But she decided that throwing petals into the air was much more fun. She ran around the front rows, tossing handful after handful of white petals overhead, laughing beneath the light spilling down from the chandelier. No one told her to stop. The whole lobby laughed with her. The drawing of the towering building with the sun sitting on top was still pinned to the bulletin board in the basement, except now someone had placed it inside a plastic frame. Ambrose Kessler stood in the last row against the wall, in the place where the chandelier light didn't reach. He hadn't been invited onto the platform. He hadn't asked to be. That year, he had testified 3 times in federal court, lost control of the entire West Waterfront port system, and sold half of what he had spent 20 years building, so that the rest could continue operating legally and transparently. His name appeared in newspapers now in a very different way than it once had. The man who had once been able to silence the entire 60th floor merely by stopping in his tracks now stood where no one paid much attention to him, his hands clasped behind his back, quietly listening, as 31 names were read aloud. When the ceremony ended and people began rising from their chairs, Delia stepped down from the platform. She passed the people who came forward to shake her hand and congratulate her, passed row after row of chairs, crossed the full length of the 60th floor lobby, and stopped in front of him. Ambrose looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't hold out his hand either. Delia reached out first. He looked at that hand for a long moment. Then he took it. This story doesn't tell us that good people will always be rewarded, because life doesn't work that simply. It tells us something else, that a person's worth is never found in the job they do, the uniform they wear, or the floor on which they stand. It is found in whether they can hold on to their dignity when no one is watching. And it tells us that the surest way to know how decent a person truly isn't to watch how they treat their equals, but to watch how they treat the people they believe are invisible. Real power has never been about having the ability to crush someone. It exists in the moment when a person has enough strength to do exactly that, and chooses not to. Every day, all around us, there are still people cleaning hallways before dawn, people working night shifts in places no one ever passes through, people we may see hundreds of times without once asking their names. Sometimes one question, one nod, one word of thanks, is enough to return to a person something an entire system has taken away from them. If Delia's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you can have more meaningful stories to listen to. How did today's story make you feel? And what do you think gave Delia the strength to stand back up? Please share your thoughts in the comments so that we can hear what comes from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting good health, happiness, and peace in every day of your lives. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.